This morning's parable is a preacher's dream come true. We have within it the term talent, which was an amount of money. A huge amount of money, as it turns out. Some scholars estimate a single talent to be equivalent to about 20 years of a day laborer's wages, while others estimate it to be as much as $1.25 million. So the parable naturally lends itself to the sermons of prosperity preachers who focus mostly on earthly riches. But because of the ambiguity of the word talent, the preacher could also deliver a stewardship sermon about one's gifts and abilities, which should under no circumstance be unused, or in the case of the third servant, buried. And it's automatically assumed that if the parable contains a king, landowner, or person going on a journey while leaving the servants behind, that character is either Jesus or God. And the return of that person is the return of Jesus at the end of time. These sorts of parables are called prescriptive parables because they prescribe a particular behavior that needs to be done until the return of Christ. In this morning's case, one needs to be responsible with one's finances or skills and use them in ways that will honor God. But Jesus also told descriptive parables, which describe the way things were in his world. It was his way of calling out justice. This sort of thing upset Roman officials and religious leaders to the point that they would eventually put him to death. I believe this morning's parable probably was originally a descriptive parable. And one of the reasons I feel that way is because the parable we read, in the parable that we read, the first two servants immediately went out and doubled their money. Even though our text says the man was just going on a journey, the original Greek implies that he could have been moving away permanently. So the two servants, maybe not expecting him to ever return, and assuming the money to be theirs for the keeping, doubled their funds. But some commentators have pointed out that in the first century one could only double an investment by using exploitative means. And if that's the case, it's likely that they used their funds to start a first century loan shark business. The third servant doesn't give in to this sort of behavior, but instead buries his money. In fact, he obeys the Talmud, which is a compilation of commentaries of Jewish law. The Talmud advises when a master leaves a subordinate, then the subordinate should take no risks with the master's money, but should bury the cash in the ground. So in our parable, the man returns and is greeted by the first two servants who show how good they have been at swindling people out of money. And the man is delighted. In contrast, he is angry that the third servant didn't turn a profit, but instead buried the money in the ground. And in retaliation, he has the servant thrown into outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. I hope you realize that this man, who is described as a harsh man, is not God. And sermons that say he is God have to do some fancy footwork around the fact that he doesn't deny that he reaps where he doesn't sow and gathers where he doesn't scatter. In other words, this man makes money off people by appointing lackeys like the first two servants. No, this man is not God. He declares the third servant to be lazy and wicked. But if anyone is lazy, it's the one who makes a living by reaping where others have sowed. And if anyone is wicked, it's the one who has no qualms about taking money from those who have the least and giving it to the ones who already have more than their needs require. The man in this parable is not God, but he is an example of the dishonest business practices that were taking place then and continue to take place even today. And Jesus was making trouble by calling it out. He was making good trouble. But when Matthew lifts up the first two servants for their money-making skills and disparages the third servant for burying his money in the ground, he seems to flip the original parable on its end, while transforming it from a descriptive parable into a prescriptive one in order to convince his audience of the need for the responsible stewardship of their finances. The parable's moral, then, is don't waste your money on useless things because you think Jesus is coming any day now. Instead, invest your money if possible because it may be a while before Christ returns. If I had been Matthew, I'm not sure that I would have turned it into a parable about money investment, but rather a parable about love. In my version, the landowner would indeed be God, and the extraordinarily large amounts of money would have represented love, the love that God gives to each of us, just as the man in the parable gives large amounts of money to his servants. And my parable would have pointed out the need to spread that love around, which naturally multiplies it. But there's no denying that love is risky, in the same way that investing money can be risky. Still, in the end, it's worth it. But there are some folks who are unwilling to take that risk, and instead bury their love. Out of fear of being hurt, they refuse to invest their love in others. Those people are represented by the third servant, who buries his money because he's afraid to risk investing it. He's afraid of losing his money the same way some people are afraid of losing their heart if they love. These people are sad people. Their hell is not one that God has condemned them to, but instead one of their own making. A hell of mistrust, loneliness, and despair. And so in my parable, God, represented by the man who returns after the journey, doesn't condemn to hell the people who have been hurt too badly and are afraid to love again, but instead frees them from the hell they have made for themselves. God embraces them and declares them to be children of God no matter what. And that's what frees them to share their love with others, and in turn, multiplying it just as the first two servants had done. The author of the Gospel of Matthew and I have two very different audiences. Matthew was writing to people who may have been frittering away their finances because they expected Jesus to return at any moment. On the other hand, I am speaking to people who haven't been told enough that you are loved by God, that there's nothing you can do to change that. You are loved by God, and you are not only free to love others, you have been commanded to do it. And in so doing, you multiply God's love. Both of us, both the gospel writer and I, in our interpretation of Jesus' parable, have taken liberties with his words. It's not that one interpretation is wrong and the other is right. There is truth within each of them. You may have an entirely different interpretation, and I would love to hear yours. I would love to hear your own truth. Maybe we can sit at a table one day and exchange the truths that the Spirit has uniquely revealed to us and our circumstances. But until that day, know that God has given to each of us an abundance of love which exceeds our imagination. And we have received that love so that we can multiply it by sharing it with others. In so doing, we share God's presence with others. May we take a risk on love. May we love with wild abandon the way that God has loved each one of us. Amen.